Adam Guillette joins us to help us break down the predicament for many of those in the news industry. He's the president of the media watchdog group, Accuracy in Media. So, Ed, I want to start with exactly what's going on with these news outlets, for example, because we have seen President Trump have an adversarial stance with a lot of those in the news media. But, for example, I don't think that's anything necessarily new. I think back to how George Bush was covered. I think back to how Mitt Romney was covered. Is this anything new, or was it just exacerbated under President Trump?
You know, it's actually dramatically new. For decades, we dealt with biased journalists that kind of meant well. You know, Accuracy in Media and others tried to expose their bias. We saw it from the 60s on. Reagan dealt with it before Bush even. But what we're dealing with today is a dramatically different animal. The media landscape is incredibly fragmented. So rather than trying to go for a broad spectrum of the audience, each news outlet goes for a specific sliver and tries to play up to them as much as possible. So MSNBC looks for stories that they know are anti-Trump. And if there aren't any, they'll make one up.
You know, that's a very interesting way to put it, because I've noticed that there's also something new, which is kind of a media reporter, if you will. For example, CNN's Brian Stelter has the responsibility of basically watching Fox News and dictating how they're covering certain events, criticizing how they're covering certain events. What about when it comes to networks versus networks? For example, I've noticed that CNN has a more adversarial stance against Fox News, the same way that many of the personalities on Fox News take a adversarial stance against CNN. Is this network versus network thing anything new?
You know, in many ways, they're not even competing, Fox News and CNN, because they're going after a dramatically different audience. CNN isn't going after the standard Fox viewers, and Fox, of course, isn't going after CNN viewers. Although, to be honest, I joke that CNN is going after people waiting to board a plane, because otherwise you never really catch anybody watching CNN anymore. It's outrageous. But they're in a different game. They're going after a hardcore left-wing audience at CNN, and they're looking for stories that will appease that audience. Instead of educating them, they're looking at that audience and telling them what they want to hear.
And that's, once again, a great point, because conflict drives a lot of ratings. I mean, people like, for example, to see the back and forth debates, which used to take place on CNN. I remember that's why I would tune in, to see a Democrat go up against a Republican with a moderator right there, hear both sides of the argument, and get the really fiery debates. But to your point right now, we don't get that anymore. And in fact, it's so much that the conflict is about Democrats versus Republicans, and you don't get to see the arguments on certain news channels. You just get to be told how bad one side is and the other. So when we look ahead to the potential Biden administration that could be taking place, will there be any conflict? Or to your point, what you were saying before, will they create some conflict to go after?
It's going to depend, of course, based on what their viewers want to see. If the viewers are happy with Biden, you're going to see endless stories about the great job that he's doing. But if all of a sudden Biden isn't going far enough to the left to appease their viewers, well, CNN and MSNBC are going to start running stories about a potential primary challenger for Biden. I think most likely, if the Republicans hold the Senate, we'll see endless stories about how Mitch McConnell is standing in the way of government getting the job done. That's going to be the conflict. And you'll see Biden proposing legislation that he would never support if he knew that Mitch McConnell would actually vote for it and send it up to him for his signature. Biden will placate his progressive base by pushing legislation that he knows he'll never have to sign into law.
And it all comes back to this idea of a double standard. I mean, I was thinking about this, was it late last week, where the Biden communications team was announced and everybody was having these glowing profiles of the very talented, very qualified women who will be in that administration if it does take place, but noticing that they did not have the same things to say about people like Haley McEnany, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Alyssa Farrow, who today, by the way, left her position. They didn't get that same type of glowing type of profiles or anything like that. So do you think that this is a thing that will last beyond a Trump administration if it takes place, a Biden administration if it takes place, that there will just always be this divide in the media from this point forward?
Well, I can't say what the future is going to look like, but in the short term, we know that these audiences are competing for an increasingly smaller pie, and they're just trying to get a little bit of a piece of it. They know the audience is going to be increasingly fragmented amongst more channels, more websites, more blogs. So they're all going to come up with the most salacious anti-Trump or pro-Biden stories they could find, because that's what sells. It's comparable to 100 years ago when you would have newspaper hawkers on the street trying to sell individual papers, and they would shout salacious yellow journalism headlines because that's what would get them a nickel.
And that's kind of the blessing and the curse, I suppose, with social media and everything that we get on the internet, is that there are so many emerging, independent, not only outlets, but also individuals. I know that there's people I go to, if there's a story about the Pentagon, I'll go to them because I know they're trusted. They have good sources on that compared to perhaps a different outlet. And I think that is a blessing and the curse in some ways, because there's also people who try to take advantage of that in some ways, posting more, as you were saying, salacious things for the sake of the clickbait, but not putting the right information in there. So I think that it's a good lesson for everybody moving forward. Look up different sources, check your facts, things of that nature, but also question what you hear as well. I think that's good advice for everyone moving forward. Adam Guillette, it's always a pleasure having you on this program. Thanks for coming on tonight and breaking down the media headlines.
Thank you so much for having me.